Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Anita, Stefano, and Stefano for the surprising invitation to present some of my work and also to expand it in novel territory during this workshop. So the title of what I'm going to do in the next 40 minutes or so is Conformorality and the City. So the let's say, opportunity of giving a talk with this audience led me to combine an interest I have at least since my doctorate degree, where I worked on social norms, and the city, based on some, philosophical work some of you might already be familiar with. So let me start from three observations. First observation is that conformity to social norms is a very widespread and surprising phenomenon. At least since the 1950s, you might know work by Solomon Asch and collaborators, where he showed that people in a group tend to comply with obviously wrong answers because of peer pressure. And that's a fairly robust phenomenon that has been replicated various times. And also it's a very real life phenomenon that to me in some ways is very surprising. For instance, when I was growing up in Italy, whenever I would take an airplane, at the end, when the landing went fine, everybody would clap. Now this norm is fading away, and if you start clapping, people will frown upon you. The second observation from which I would like to start is that conformity, at least in some philosophical circles, has a very bad reputation, typically associated with herd mentality. Here are a couple of, paradigmatic quotations. One is from Kant, from What is Enlightenment, where he says that enlightenment is the release of human beings from the self-incurred tutelage. Tutelage is the inability to use one's own reason without direction from somebody else. And so here Kant is inviting people, human, to enlighten themselves by thinking autonomously. Nietzsche, in Beyond Good and Evil, also emphasizes the importance of autonomy and greatness that is far away from social conformity. Here is what he says. Greatness entails wanting to be oneself, being able to be different, standing alone, and having to live independently. So that's the second observation. Conformism sometimes is seen as bad. The third is that cities sometimes have been at least designed with some moral or political ideal in mind. And sometimes these political ideals, for instance, here you see a map of Palma, a city in the northeast of Italy from the Renaissance, the early 1600s, has been inspired by a certain geometry that reflects a cosmic order. And so the idea here that has been, discussed by several philosophers throughout history, and also, as far as I know, some architects and urban planners, is that the city, the geometry of a city, is a reflection of the geometric order of morality. Likewise, if you just think of the physical constraints of a city, you will see that the physical constraints afford certain encounters, certain interactions. Okay, so the idea of affordance can also play out in the link between the geometry of a city and how we relate to one another. So with these three observations in the background, I would like to ask three questions, very broad, and explore these questions, especially this one, the last one about the relationship between conformorality and urban planning, with your help. So I'm going to start off by providing you with a characterization of conformism, I'm gonna give you an idea of some psychological findings relevant to understand the nature of conformity and the nature of social norms. I'm going to describe very quickly the experiment that Stefano mentioned very generously a moment ago in collaboration with Chiara Lisciandra and Marie Posma. And then I'm going to ask the question, when is conformity good or bad? Okay, so I mentioned that some people believe it's bad, it's sort of sheepish mentality, but it's also incredibly useful, to conform with other people's behavior. And so the question is, when is it good and how is it good? So let me start from a definition of conformity. So conformity can be understood as the tendency, both human and also animal tendencies, and possibly also plants' tendency to modify their behavior or ideas to align with others' ideas and behavior surrounding us. Okay, so this definition already puts into focus a couple of things. One thing is that conformity, this tendency to align with others, can also involve social learning, that is, acquiring ideas and behaviors by observing people around us. And so it can be a social learning strategy, very effective, which can distinguish conformism from just recurrent collective patterns that are not examples of conformism. What's an example of a recurrent collective pattern? In the morning, I brush my teeth. I assume most of you, hopefully all, do the same. That's an example of recurrent collective pattern of behavior that is not based, obviously, in any obvious way, on conformism or any social norm. There is a plurality of approaches in multiple fields, of course. Given my background, I'm mostly interested in social psychological approaches and computational approaches to social norms, their dynamics, and the conditions under which people comply with norms. And so my focus is on characteristic motives and expectations that can distinguish non-compliance and conformity from other social patterns of behavior. So what are these expectations and motives that are characteristic of conformity? There are two kinds of expectations that have been emphasized both in social psychology, I have in mind work by Robert Cialdini, for instance, and philosophy, and here I have in mind work by Cristina Bicchieri. So these patterns of expectations come in two kinds. The first kind is descriptive expectations about what most people in a certain context do. Okay, so question here is really, whether I expect that most people do a certain thing in a certain context. Okay? This is a first order expectation. A second order expectation, which in the literature I'm familiar with, and again Cristina Bicchieri is an example of an author, uses normative expectations as a second order expectation. That is, I expect that most people in a certain context expect me to follow a certain pattern of behavior. And if I don't do that, then I might risk certain sanctions, okay, social sanctions. So given these two patterns of expectations, the next step is to ask, under what conditions do they give us a motivation to comply with a certain regularity, a certain rule? And also here we can distinguish two kinds of motivations. First kind of motivation is a reputational or social kind of motivation. At the beginning of my presentation, I mentioned the Solomon Asch work. Asch had participants in an experiment where they had to judge the length of different lines on a whiteboard. And together with these experimental participants, there were a number of confederates. The confederates would give the obviously wrong answer about the line matching on a whiteboard matching a target line. And participants were puzzled. And many of them who complied with the obviously incorrect answer, they explained their judgment, their compliance, because of they were afraid of being frowned upon. That is, maybe people would think that I'm stupid. Maybe people would think that I should be ashamed because I give this judgment. So this kind of reputational motive, okay, is helpful to distinguish private information I don't want to disclose because participants in the ASH experiment were convinced that what they were saying was obviously incorrect. They were giving the wrong answer. But their public behavior tracked what it seemed to be the socially desirable response. Okay? And so given my expectations about the punishment or social response in complying or failing to comply with a general behavioral pattern, I might be more or less inclined to comply with that pattern, regardless of what I believe privately about whether or not that behavior or judgment is correct. A very different kind of motive is an informational kind of motive, typically in situations of uncertainty, okay, by observing others, and especially observing others that people judge as experts, okay, I can learn new things. And so my motivation here is not so much to save face by complying with other people's behavior, but it's just to learn new things that might be correct or morally good. Okay? Again, it's important to disentangle these different kinds of motivations, especially when it comes to designing an environment that calls for compliance. And I have a bunch of examples in mind. During Q&A, we can revisit some of these examples. The examples I have in mind are about crafting certain messages. For instance, in hotel rooms, now you have messages about sustainable behavior, whether or not you should reuse towels. Sometimes these messages are crafted in terms of what most people do in a similar situation. In other situations, the same message, at least the message aiming at sustainability, is crafted more in terms of, by doing this, the environment will be happy. Okay, so you already see how these kinds of informations can boost compliance for very different reasons, either reputational or informational. Informational motives are very much linked to social learning. I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that conformity is an incredibly useful strategy for social learning. This learning facilitated by observation or interaction with other individuals. This paper by Rachel Kendall and collaborators provides a very good overview of how conformity works as a strategy for social learning, zooming in on various biases relevant to conformity. What are these biases? Biases to copy specific behaviors, the what kind of behavior should I conform to, performed by specific individuals, a who kind of bias, in specific circumstances, the when kind of bias. So let me now go through these three kinds of biases, and then in the what kind of bias, I'm going to plug, say, the experiment on conformorality I collaborated on. So conforming with what can depend on the assessment of the value of doing something or refraining from doing something based on different considerations. One consideration is the adaptive significance of following others' behavior. This is a very interesting study run in Australia with cockatoos, It turned out that researchers observed a pattern of behavior where cockatoos were able to open trash bins for food, but not everywhere, just in specific neighborhoods in Sydney. What turned out to be the case is that the neighborhoods where cockatoos learned this behavior were neighborhoods where other cockatoos started to do the same. And so there was a copying based on the adaptive significance of acquiring that kind of behavior, that is learning how to open a trash bin for food. And this again suggests that conformity is not just a human business, but it's much broader than that. And part of the reason is that conformity can have adaptive significance also from an evolutionary perspective. Other two aspects of the assessment, either implicit or explicit, of the value of a behavior can depend on the emotional charge of that behavior. Here I have in mind prescriptions to comply with behavior that is not hygienic or not sanitary. We have an emotional response to unsanitary behavior, and that response is disgust. And disgust, again, keeps us away from toxins and poisons. And so we do have good reason to comply with the behaviors of people around us based on the emotional charge of what they are doing. For instance, if they are refraining from drinking a glass of water where somebody spit in it, I'm sure nobody did that.
You never know.
Here, I never know, but now I do know because I trust you. Okay, so refraining from that kind of behavior can also have, an adaptive significance in terms of health and hygiene. And the third aspect that plays in this assessment of the value of a behavior can be also explicit conscious deliberation about whether or not complying with a certain behavior is right or wrong. Now, given these two features, that is the emotional charge of certain behaviors that seem to be beyond our conscious control, and these other feature that seems to pull in the opposite direction, that is conscious deliberation about whether a behavior is good or bad, then the question is, do these two features of the what bias mean that for certain behaviors people cannot comply, cannot conform, that is group pressure wouldn't work in certain domains? Well, that's the kind of question we addressed in this paper with Chiara Lisciandra and Marie Posma. And here we really wanted to understand whether certain kinds of norms could be distinguished based on the extent to which they are resistant to group pressure. Now, in this study, we were specifically interested in three kinds of norms that we have reason to distinguish based on theoretical grounds. The first kind of norms is what we call, or what I would call, social norms, like tipping, queuing, dress codes, greetings, clapping. All these are examples of social norms whose force, motivational force, is conditioned on having the right kinds of expectations. Okay? Insofar as I expect many people to leave a tip after a meal, and insofar as I expect that those people expect me to leave a tip after a meal, I will be inclined to do the same. Notice that this social norm, a social norm like tipping, is not generalizable to other places or times, so you have a locality here. And also non-conformity involves typically relatively mild sanctions, because these violations involve typically no harm or obvious injustice. The second kind of judgment or kind of social norm we were interested in is moral judgment. These think of behaviors like stealing, killing, cheating, exploiting, and so forth. Here, it seems that the motivational and normative force of these norms are independent or more unconditional on the authority of an individual or other people's expectations. Okay, so if most people in a certain situation, steal on each other, then that behavior doesn't give me a good reason to do the same. That's the meaning of this first feature. That is the normative force of these behaviors, unlike the social norms I described a moment ago, is not, say, linked to a certain authority, either individual authority or the authority of a community. Which means that these kinds of norms are generalizable to other places and times, and also means that non-conformity typically are serious violations because they involve violations of principles of justice, harm, or basic rights. The third kind of norms we were interested in are what we call decency norms. These norms proscribing certain behaviors having to do with organic decay or non-standard sexual practices or creepy crawlies. Okay, so the motivational force of refraining from doing these things, okay, is unconditional on the authority of an individual, similarly to moral norms. It's also generalizable, okay, similarly to moral norms, but unlike moral norms, non-conformity here doesn't obviously involve violations that are harmful to a society as a whole, or, say, violations of principles of justice. Non-conformity typically here involves violations of norms of hygiene and may cause disease. And so, given these three kinds of norms, we wanted to check whether participants in a sort of Ash-like setting would be resistant to social pressure. So what we did in this study was to ask individual participants who were university students in the Netherlands to give a rating of different behaviors in terms of their morality. Okay? And then we said to these participants, hey, by mistake, we lost your data. So come back to the lab and to make things more efficient, we're going to run the same thing in groups of 4. Unbeknownst to the participants, the group of 4 included 3 confederates that responded to each one of the scenarios in the way we wanted. And the way we wanted was to go in the opposite direction as the original judgment of a participant. Okay, so that was the setting. We had also a different condition that was not face-to-face in the lab, but was online. What we found was that conformism applied to all domains, that is the social norms, moral norms, and decency norms. But some qualifications applied. Moral judgments were less prone to conformism, according to theoretical predictions we had. There was no difference between social and decency norms, which was surprising to us. And the type of communication, face-to-face versus online, mattered, which means that people online were less inclined to conform to, group behavior, okay, which you can explain in terms of the reputational motive being very low, because there was no reputation and there was very little at stake in, providing a judgment on a certain scenario in an online kind of setting compared to a face-to-face kind of setting. Notice that we did not control for variables like the identity of the group members. We did control for the sex of the participants, but not for things like age, nationality, or perceived status in a group. But these things do matter when it comes to complying with other people's behavior or to conform with them. And that's the who kind of bias. The who kind of bias means that the assessment of the value of whom to follow depends on who that person is. So you can have high status individuals, influencers, that have more traction on people's tendency to align their behavior with them, even when the behavior is meaningless or lacks any adaptive value whatsoever. The second feature of who is perceived expertise, and this kind of feature is more directly connected to the informational motives to comply with a certain behavior. Why? Well, if I'm uncertain about whether or not I should tip in a new country, well, maybe I will ask a person waiting tables, because that person is the expert, probably, in that context. Other features that matter, of course, are age, sex, nationality, and depending on the intersection of these features, again, people's behavior can be more or less likely to align with the behavior of a certain high status individual. Finally, conforming when, that is, under what conditions, in what context are we biased towards complying with a certain norm. Here, the assessment of the value of conformity depends on things like uncertainty, which I mentioned a number of times already, but also the relative cost of asocial learning, that is, how much time and effort would be required in learning, a social norm of tipping simply by not asking somebody else, but waiting and observing, interactions between diners and patrons in a restaurant. So if the cost of associative learning is too high, then it pays off just to rely on conformity and following, say, the behavior, typical behavior in a community. These two features that also play out in conforming when, which are the proportion of people adopting the behavior and the observed number of instances of the behavior, can come apart. Okay, so what I have in mind here is whether you observe instances of the behavior from multiple people versus from one individual only. There are experiments in developmental psychology with children where what matters the most is the proportion of people adopting the behavior, not just the sheer number of instances of the behavior. Okay? Now, given these biases, the next question I want to ask is, when is it good or bad to conform? Okay, so far, I just provided you with a definition of what conformity is as a tendency to modify behavior or ideas to align with those of others around us. I emphasized characteristic motivations and expectations involved in conformity. I described a case of conformorality with our study where pretty much all norms were subject to group pressure, but some norms, specifically moral norms having to do with harm and justice, were relatively more resistant to group pressure. And finally, I highlighted how conformity is one strategy for social learning that is biased by several factors. So when is it good or bad to conform? So let me tell you a story where conformity was bad. This is a story of Ignaz Semmelweis. He was a medical doctor in Vienna. He was appointed in the General Hospital in Vienna in one of the first obstetric clinic in Europe. There were actually two obstetric institutes where women would give birth. One was attended by young doctors. The second was attended by midwives. Semmelweis observed that in the first clinic, where women would give birth, say, were attended by young doctors, the rate of death because of childbed fever was way higher compared to the rate of death in the, say, institute attended by midwives. Semmelweis conjectured that possibly the young doctors, mostly males, would transfer corpuscular kind of diseases to the women in bed. And his kind of suggestion was, well, just wash your hands. The young doctors realized that this was nonsense, and actually they took offense because they felt that Semmelweis was just being too in control of their behavior, which to them was just fine. There was nothing dirty in their hands, and so they had clean hands. So this is an example where the conjecture was on the right track. He was a maverick, proposing something new that nowadays, seems completely, common sense. But because of partly emotional reactions, taking offense because maybe, they felt dirty, and possibly because of a tradition of a practice, medical practice, they didn't take up Semmelweis' advice. And this lack of conformity, or better put, this continuous conformity with the tradition led to deaths, a lot of deaths of women. And Semmelweis actually had a very sad ending also in a psychiatric clinic where he died. So this is a case of lack of conformity from the scientific community that is being used in some modeling work by two philosophers led by Callan O'Connor, where they focused on the role of conformity in different kinds of networks, different kinds of situations. The main claim of this modeling work is that conformity can limit knowledge. So their focus here is on epistemic dynamics, that is, to what extent conformity is it good when it comes to knowledge and learning. And the claim Weatherall and O'Connor make based on modeling results is that on the whole, conformity tends to produce less successful scientific outcomes via processes similar to those in the Semmelweis case. They also emphasize that the structure of a community, scientific community, is key to understand how group behavior can spread and form cliques, form polarized groups, can form echo chambers and epistemic bubbles. Okay, so basically they played around with different kinds of networks where nodes on these networks are agents. Agents had two options. One of these options was correct and the other was incorrect. Okay, and based on what other agents around them would choose, each agent had to choose the behavior accordingly. Okay, and so given these networks, what these authors emphasize is that conformity can be good, but it can also be bad epistemically, and specifically can contribute to echo chambers and epistemic bubbles. If you are interested in these results, again, I can expand on them during the Q&A, if you are curious. Let me zoom in onto two results from this modeling study. One result, again, has to do with the network structures leading to echo chambers and epistemic bubbles. These are kinds of informational cascades. These are structures that filter out certain information and can increase or decrease the self-confidence of people in that network. So epistemic bubbles typically are networks where a certain kind of information is not transmitted and is not say, discussed at all. So basically, in a slogan, in an epistemic bubble, you simply do not hear people from the outside. And this is a phenomenon that is being studied extensively, especially in relation to Facebook and other social media, where people tend to be friends with like-minded people, sharing pretty much the same news and being on the same page politically and also morally. A different kind of informational cascade is echo chambers. In echo chambers, the keyword is trust. That is, people from the outside might be present with their voices, with their information, but they are not trusted. So in echo chambers, members live similarly as a cult, religious cult. Okay? So these types of informational cascades have detrimental effects when it comes to knowledge and understanding. And I think, the recent pandemic can also be used as an illustration of these two phenomena on social media. Then somebody might ask, well, what's the remedy here to these kinds of informational cascades and their effects? So a potential remedy, sort of Kantian kind of slogan is start thinking for yourself. Well, in a way, this is meaningless. Why? Because we are social creatures, and the advance of knowledge does require conformity. Evolutionary psychologists like Richardson and Boyd studied the design of the kayak, and they point out that if people fail to conform to certain design features in building a kayak, then there wouldn't be a kayak nowadays at all. So there is a conformity required to amplify and distribute knowledge across communities, but also across times. So it means that we are very much dependent on each other in almost every domain of knowledge. And so learning and knowledge obviously depend on trust, which comes with two dimensions. More knowledge dimension, that is trust experts, epistemic authorities as knowledgeable, but also trust people testimonies as sincere and based on goodwill. So by saying start thinking for yourself is not just meaningless because we are social creatures, but it's also detrimental when it comes to our learning and flourishing morally. So one, it is epistemically good to conform. So there is this phenomenon called the wisdom of crowd, which again is sometimes associated with Galton's example of guessing the weight of an ox in a market. Okay? In this example, a wisdom of crowd effect would emerge if four conditions are in place. The first condition is that opinions in a community about what's true and what's false are diverse. These opinions are independent from each other. So whether I believe that a certain cow, let's say, is 500 kilos and Stefano believes that it's 100 kilos, our judgments are statistically independent. So my judgment doesn't make a difference to what Stefano judges and vice versa. That's what independence means. And it's in most real life cases, it's an idealization that does not obtain. The third kind of condition is an incentive for sincerity. That is, we don't have reason not to disclose private information we have about a certain topic. And finally, opinions are not systematically biased, possibly because of, a perceived authority in a community, or possibly because of the way we communicate with one another. That is the kind of network we find ourselves in. So the next question is, do these conditions apply in the moral domain. These are good conditions for wisdom of crowds kind of phenomena, where there is a ground truth and we have to judge whether a certain proposition, a certain hypothesis is true or false. Do these conditions apply in the normative domain or moral domain? We have reason to believe that they don't, really, that this conformism can also thwart moral progress, similarly to the case of Semmelweis I discussed a moment ago. Diversity of opinions on some, but not many issues, is present in a given social community. Okay? Independence is very unlikely given the fact of moral education and given the fact that typically, again, we hang out with like-minded people. We also have here, more so than in the epistemic domain, strong incentives to hide our real opinions about certain subjects, to avoid negative social repercussions. And this is, I think, especially salient nowadays on social networks, social media networks. And the fourth condition, again, is that there are systematic psychological and also institutional biases also in the moral domain. And so conformism, given that these four ideal conditions are unlikely to be, say, fulfilled, can limit moral progress. The next question, and last in the next 5 to 10 minutes I have, is whether, environmental factors can make a difference with respect to conformity. With respect to conformity to behaviors or ideas that are true or appropriate or correct. In a question, can human planning play a role in morality or more generally conformorality? And that's where what Stefano said at the beginning applies to this. I know nothing about urban studies, and so your input here will be very much appreciated. So let me start from some general remarks, then I'm going to give you 3 examples fairly quickly, and then let me conclude with some promissory notes about something I might do. If you think it's complete nonsense, just tell me. So, one observation is that if I think of philosophical work and also some work by non-philosophers into architecture and cities, there seems to be a strong connection between cities and political philosophies. That is, the city sometimes is a reflection of political ideals. And these political ideals can be organized in a typology. This typology is the animal model, a cosmic model, and a functional model, where moral geometries reflect a certain, say, order. In the animal model, the city follows the order of an embodied living system, so it would be an organism. According to the cosmic model, the city is a reflection of the order of the cosmos, of the universe. And in the functional model, the city is a well-oiled machine. Let me give you 3 exemplars of each one of these models, bearing in mind that they are not mutually exclusive, these models, and often they juxtapose on one another. The first example I have in mind is Plato's Atlantis. Atlantis, according to Plato, who is the main source of information we have about it in the Critias and also in the Timaeus, is described as the size of, it's greater than Libya and Asia, okay, Atlantis. Atlantis was an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and it was allotted to Poseidon, the god of the sea. Poseidon fell in love with Cleitus, a human living on Atlantis. They made love on this island, and after their love, Poseidon decided to carve out 3 little islands on Atlantis and to found a city. From their intercourse, Cleitus had 5 pairs of twins, all males. And these 10 individuals became kings of the city of Atlantis. What's striking to me here is that Atlantis and Poseidon follow certain geometry. So there is circularity, concentric circularity, where at the center you have the most important part of the city with a temple and with the most important ruler of the island of Atlantis, Atlas. This is an example of, say, the animal model, to my mind, because of a couple of reasons. One reason is that in the background here, you also have to understand that for Plato, justice in a city is whenever each member of the city and each part of the city fulfills their role. You might remember that in the Republic, there are 3 categories of humans. Okay, there are the philosophers, who are king, there are the warriors, and there are the workers. And these 3 categories of people corresponded to a part of the soul or the mind. And insofar as this, society would work well according to their function, the city would stay in homeostasis. And homeostasis would be a sort of dynamic that both contributes to the flourishing of the people and also self-perpetuates itself by boosting conformity to the laws. What happened here is that people in Atlantis became greedy, selfish, and so, because of an earthquake, they were wiped out of the map. That's the first example of a city reflecting a sort of organic model. And again, here the moral geometry of the city reflects the geometry of a body, and justice depends on each part of the city fulfilling its own function. Second example, which is a bit blurry here, is Campanella's City of the Sun. Here we are in the early 1600s. Okay, this would be a model that reflects features of the cosmos. It's very much inspired by Plato and by Renaissance work on the ideal city, on utopia, that is a place nowhere, like for instance by work by Thomas More or Bacon on the New Atlantis. Important features I would like to draw your attention to here is that the circular kind of geometry, where the circle was understood as a perfect kind of figure in geometry. These walls are 7, like the planets. Okay, so again, a reflection of the order of the cosmos. The doors, the entrances here, follow the axis north, south, east, west. And this ideal also became with a political drive towards equality. In fact, the inhabitants of the City of the Sun would wear the very same dresses for Campanella. There would be complete equality except for the ruler, who is the philosopher. The philosopher inspired by the sun god. Okay? The last example I want to briefly describe, and then I'm gonna end, is Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier, Swiss French architect, urban planner, working in between the two world wars, is moving away from the circle as a perfect figure. Instead, is trying to retool features of Roman colonies. That is the grid and the line, the straight line, as the perfect geometry because of its functionality. So the idea here is that the city should be a well-oiled machine that promotes people civilization, that is push away from barbarism and entering a brave new world. We want cities that accommodate millions of people. So cities with tall skyscrapers, with a high density, but still not with a circular geometry, but with a grid. So that's another unfulfilled projects, because these three projects I described were never implemented in real life. Now, given these three examples, and I'm done, I want to ask, how can we assess, empirically, these very abstract ideas? That there is, some reflection of, conformorality in the geometry of a city. This might be fancy, but again, I want to find some way of evaluating whether there is, a connection between the geometry of a city and the moral geometry of its dwellers. Here is a bunch of starting observations, and then I'm done. Focusing on these properties of a city, for instance, the number of inhabitants, density, kinds of spaces where people encounter some, but not all, dwellers in the city. Spaces for people with different roles and statuses, and also the physical constraints and affordances of a city, that is, given the overall geometry. How can we understand, the link between some of these properties and moral conformity? So one possible approach, and again, this depends mainly on my background, would be to cook up, to design an idealized agent-based model. Okay, this agent-based model would have agents with beliefs and preferences and some tendency to conformity. Agents would move around in a city and adjust their beliefs and behavior based on people they encounter. Possible independent variables given the setup here would be, for instance, the geometry and the physical structure of the city. I can also play around with the kinds of beliefs and preferences and social roles and tendency to conform of the agents in this model. Potential things that I can check, given this setup, are the emergence of norm-guided behavior, that is, cliques, groups that conform only to some, but not all, polarization, and the distribution of beliefs in such a setup. So this is just a sketch of something that could be done relatively easily. The challenges for me are, is there any empirical data that can be used, to fit or to constrain any of these variables? And the second general question is, does this sound nonsense or just, a philosophy kind of toy game? Or is this something potentially interesting also for urban planners with an applied basic kind of research? So this was pretty much all for me. Thank you very much for your attention.